Hi everybody, it's Doc Horowitz here to introduce you to kind of an unusual module and probably covering a topic that most of us don't give a lot of thought to, but we end up doing it because we have to. And that's when on occasion we have to actually deliver what I call bad news to another individual. Sometimes it can be a family member, a friend, a colleague, and so on. One way or another, we know that it's got to be done. And particularly as leaders, this is not an option to not deliver bad news. That would be perceived as actually a weak leader or an inconsistent leader. So it's not like you have any option here. Bad news is a part of life. And most reasonable people can understand that, and they can handle bad news. What they can't and shouldn't handle is news that is demeaning or delivered in a demeaning way, offensive, insulting, designed to exert power over another individual and generally make them feel bad. That should never be the purpose in delivering so-called bad news. The real purpose in doing so is really what I describe as getting somebody back on track. If they're a student in a classroom and they're disrupting, the purpose of communicating that to both student and parent is so the child can eliminate that poor behavior and get back to the business of learning. That's what schools are for. In other areas, such as organizations that involve business or government or any other agency, you may find, as particularly as a leader or supervisor, there will be on occasion individuals who, let's say, violate guidelines or policies, and that's unacceptable. But it isn't unacceptable just because the rule was broken, if you will. It's unacceptable because when someone engages in inappropriate or unacceptable behavior, they impact the organization itself. Kind of goes back to our discussions about systems theory. Whatever happens in one place impacts every other part of the organization and ultimately impacts productivity and maximizing employee productivity. So, how did this all come about? Well, once upon a time, I was actually an assistant principal. And as you probably know, most of the time spent by assistant principals is disciplining. Teachers send kids down who aren't behaving well, disrupting the class, maybe they're using profanity. And of course, this interferes with the teacher's ability to instruct, her primary function, his primary function. And so off they go to the assistant principal, happened to be me at the time, and I, of course, pulled out my trusty discipline code and looked up the offense and called the parent and generally told the parent the behavior was inappropriate, and in some cases the child would be suspended from school. And of course, this was no news to most parents because most parents do know their kids. And so when they heard this news, what typically would happen, yes, they kind of accepted it, but depending on how I delivered it, it was whether or not they supported it that really mattered. And in most cases, they didn't. Most parents who are parents of children who have these kinds of problems can be defensive. They've heard it before, and they're hearing it again. And in some cases, what they end up doing psychologically is they themselves become the victim rather than the child. So you're not just disciplining the child, you're kind of disciplining the parent from their point of view. And that can invite defensive behavior. And that's a whole different topic. And we'll talk about how to deal with defensive behavior when this module ends and we go to our next module. So I got tired, if you will, of being right, so to speak, as the authority, but having parents argue with me, accusing me of being unfair, not watching the other kids, and their child had a good reason for what they did, and so on and so on. And yes, while I diligently enforced the discipline code, I went home many a day being being stressed out, if you will. I knew there had to be a better way, and I stumbled upon one. And that is how this module got created. Because I realized once I realized that this wasn't so much about conveying a message about a bad behavior. That was understandable. It was how you did it, how it was heard, what your tone, what your intention was. And as I started this introduction, I want to remind you again, it isn't to enforce a discipline code, it's to get a colleague or an employee back on track, because their misbehavior, if you will, is disrupting the process of productivity. That is much easier for individuals to handle if you give them a reason other than they broke the law, so to speak. And none of this interaction is usually about the crime of the century. They're very common occurrences. If it's about employees in a workplace, maybe it's their coming late, maybe it's their being absent too often, maybe they're not following the guidelines that have been established. But by definition, there can only be one crime of the century. So let's assume that these employees or students are okay. They're there because they want or need an education, and they're there to do a good job. So the idea is to let them know they're okay, and we're going to be okay when this communication is over. Because there are a couple of major communication rules at play if you want to be an effective communicator. One, you're the professional. You have some strategies to help this communication along, and therefore you have the ultimate responsibility for keeping it effective. And the most important end result has to be maintaining a positive relationship. So if you use language, if you use tone that is demeaning and offensive, you can never take that back. That's another cardinal rule in communication. Once it's said, it can't be unsaid, and it can impact your relationships, which in the end is probably more important than the offense that you actually convene the meeting for. So there are other rules of the road we're going to talk about, and I'm going to take you through about 5 steps. I always seem to have a template for a strategy that I think is going to make you a more effective communicator and certainly a better leader. Thank you.